And so yeah, let's get started. So looking at this assignment for this week, so we're going to create art for the reward for the player to collect. And this is just going to be simple. There's lots of different types of items that you might have in a game. What we're going to create is just like basically like if you're collecting coins in Mario or rings in Sonic, it's just kind of like adding to your score. But the same basic setup that we're going to use could also be used to add items to your inventory, or like a key to open a door, or other components that you might want to put in a game that we'll talk about more when we start talking about level design and things like that. And then this we'll do on Thursday. We're going to create art for an obstacle for the player to avoid. And then we'll kind of go through the rest of this stuff. And for each one of our art components, we want to have an idle state and a collected state or an active state. You could actually have more states than that, but those are kind of the basic ones. So we want to have one state for the item that should be animated. It should be like drawing attention to itself so the player knows it's something they can interact with. And then when the player interacts with the item, it shouldn't just like disappear immediately because it'll be kind of confusing. We'll have a short animation where it kind of like disappears or does something cool. So that way, our player, we're communicating the changes that are happening in the game to the player. So we're going to start with the art. So I'm going to go into Pascal. And so I'm just going to come up with a little reward for my player. And I don't need it to be like super big or anything like that. It should be bigger than the player. Let's actually take a look at our art for our game. And I just want to check the size of the player again. Oops. Okay, so the player's pretty small. I should probably make the player bigger. But the player's 32 by 32. That's actually small enough. I'm just going to go with a 32 by 32 image as the default. And maybe I'll make the player bigger at some point. But yeah, so I just wanted to check the size of the player. Hey, Francis. We're just getting started. We're talking about adding rewards into the game, so items that we can collect. So I'm going to start with the art, and then I'm going to add the art into Godot, and then add a little simple script to make it work. All right, so let's save this. So I'm going to go to the save, and I'm going to save this as a reward, and I'm just going to put some apples in the scene for the player to collect. So I'm going to recall this reward underscore apple. So if I add other rewards later, that way they'll be nice and organized. So I'm going to save this and go to art. And I'll make a new folder for this. I'll call it items. So I'll say new folder and call it items. And this is just for the original artwork. This is not part of the game itself. So I've got my reward apple. And so for this one, I'm going to make a little outline with a circle so I can draw around it. I'm going to center that. And then go to the next frame and turn on my onion skin so I can just draw on top of this. So I'm going to make an apple. I want it to stand out in the scene, so I'm going to make it like bright red so the player knows that they can collect it. So then I'll get my pen tool and just draw. Oh, I forgot to, so I have to draw the part where the stem comes out, and then the part at the bottom. And let's get rid of that little one, and then I'll fill that in. And that looks actually not bad for a first try. Let's center this. And then I'll get another color to draw the stem. Get like a dark brown color. Oops. Let's get the pen tool. And I'll just draw the stem like that. That looks pretty good. And maybe I'll put in like a little leaf or something. But actually, I forgot what I should do before I draw any details is I should duplicate this frame because I want to make a little animation. So I'm going to duplicate the frame a couple times. And then actually I'll just erase the stem on the second and third frames. Okay, so then I'll turn the animation back on. And then I'm just going to draw the stem to make it look like it's like turning around a little bit. So it'll just be like a simple animation. And let's slow it down a little bit. Okay, it's a little goofy, but I'm gonna move on. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. If I want to put some like details on, I could use the lighten darken tool. And let's see, I'm gonna hold shift to apply once per pixel. And maybe I'll just put like a little highlight on the side of the apple. So it looks like it's kind of turning around, something like that. So that's okay. It's not perfect, but that's good enough for right now. I think there's like a little too much here. Okay, that's good enough that it'll kind of look like the apple's spinning around. And so that'll draw attention to it so the player will be attracted to it and want to see if it's interactive. So that's basically what we want to do for our basic apple. So I'm going to save this. And now I'm going to add in the collected state. So I'm going to do this one a little bit differently than how I did my character animations, just to demonstrate that I can actually have multiple animations in one sprite sheet if I want to save a little bit of time. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate my first frame and bring it down here. And so when the character finds the apple, they're just going to eat the apple. And so this will be the first frame of my collected animation. So all I'm going to do is just like take a bite out of the apple, and then I'm going to kind of animate the rest of the apple being eaten up. So there's a bite there, and I'll just duplicate that and take another bite out. So I'm just doing a really simple version of this. You guys could play around with different ways to make the item disappear. So there's another bite. And oops, meant to duplicate the frame. And I'll take one more big bite, and that'll be the last frame, and then the apple will be gone after this. So I don't really need to have a frame where it's just empty because it's going to be gone anyway. So that'll be the last frame before the apple disappears. So these first 3 frames of my sprite sheet are going to be the idle animation. And then these last 4 frames here are going to be the collected animation that happens when we collect the apple. So I can have both of my animations in one sprite sheet. That saves me a little bit of time in terms of opening a new Pascal and saving a new file and doing a bunch of other stuff. So this one, that's pretty simple. So I'm just going to save that and export it. And so I'm already open on my game because Pascal remembers where I'm working on. But in case you're not, just go to the desktop, game project, and then into the game folder itself, and then into the sprites folder, and save this as reward apple. And so that looks good. I'm going to save this and leave Pascal. And then I have my game folder open. So let's take a look at the sprite sheet. Here it is. And so you can see that when it got exported, it figured out it needs to have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames. So it did 3 by 3. So we'll see that when we import it. So there's our sprite. And now we're going to put it into Godot. And once we have it in Godot, we're going to have to add a little bit of scripting so that our player can collect the apple. So that's the art component. Any questions before we move on to the Godot part? Okay, cool. So let's go over to Godot. So I'm just going to open up Godot from my desktop and click on my game and click Edit. And so we're making a new component. So right now in our game, we have a couple different scenes. So in my scenes folder, I have like my first scene that I created. And I have this like auto tile scene that I created. And I have a platform scene that I created, which needs a little work, but there it is. And then I also have this background scene that I've created. So I have a few different scenes in here, but then I also have my components folder with my player component. And keep in mind that the reason we have this components folder is because our main scenes, and eventually we'll probably create a levels folder so we don't have like all these scenes sitting around. But our player component goes into all of these different scenes. And so that's a big thing that we want to keep working with is this kind of like separation of our different components. I'm going to make this apple, but I don't want to put one apple into one scene like right here. I want to make an apple that I can put into as many scenes as I want to, as many times as I want to. And so in order to do that, I need to make a separate component. So that's what we're going to do first is make our component, and then we'll add it into our scenes in a minute. So I'm going to get rid of all my scenes, and now I just have like this empty scene. And for my apple, I'm going to use a special kind of node called an area, 2D. And so what this is like a area that will detect if the player is inside of the area. So that way we can tell if our player is overlapping with our item. So it's a little bit like our player's kinematic body, but it doesn't have as much components. It doesn't do as much stuff because it's not going to be interacting with the physics in the scene. We're not going to be applying gravity to it or moving it around. It's just going to be stationary. So an area 2D is all we really need for this. So I'm going to click create. And I'm going to change the name of this to Apple and then save it. And you don't have to call it Apple, obviously. You could call it item or some generic term, or you could use a specific term for whatever type of item you're collecting. So then when I save this, I want to make sure to go into the scenes folder and go into components. And I can call this Apple, that's fine. Or you could call it item. There's different options there. So I'm going to click save there. I forgot we turned our background blue, so all of our scenes are blue now. But that's cool. So here's our apple. So notice I already have like a little warning thing here. For the area to be able to collide with other shapes in the scene, I need a collider. So I'm going to add a collision shape, just like I did with the player. So I'm going to click on the main apple node, and then click plus, and I'll type in collision shape 2D, and just hit enter. And this one has a warning saying I need a shape. So I'm going to go over to the inspector and look at the shape. And since my apple is basically a circle, that's a pretty good choice for the shape. So I'm going to go to circle. And we can zoom in a little bit. And there's our collider. So this blue area is not going to be visible. Oh, it's kind of hard to see. Maybe I should change my background. Let's go to project settings. I wonder if I can change the editor background. I usually don't actually change the background, so I haven't really thought about this much before. Where's the environment? Okay, I'm going to set it back to gray. I don't know if that's going to mess up some of my scenes, but we'll go with that for now. Okay, so now we can see this a little bit better. So this blue area, it's not part of my visuals. It's just to show me what the shape of this collision is. And what's going to happen, essentially, let me get my pen tool out. So my player has its own collision shape. So let's say my player collision shape looks like this, and inside of it is the player. So when the edge of this collision shape runs into the edge of my player's collision shape, or if it overlaps, this will alert my program to a collision. And we'll look at that in a second, but this will basically say like, you know, ouch, this is running into me or something like that. And then based on that collision, that's called an event. So when that event gets triggered, we can use code to decide what to do at that point. So our collision shape is separate from our art because we don't need to know if we ran into the art, we just need to know if we ran into this object. So we'll program that up in a second. So we've got our collision shape, and now we just need our art. So I'm going to click on the main node again and click plus, and I'm going to use an animated sprite for the art. And so let's put this above the collision shape because we're going to want to see it on top. And now we can click on the frames and create some new sprite frames, and then click on the sprite frames to edit. And so we're going to have two animations. We're going to have one for when the item is just sitting there. So we'll call that idle. And then we're going to have one for when it gets collected. So I'm going to call that collected. So most of the time, we're just going to see the idle animation. But when the player gets the item, we're going to play the collected animation so that we know that we've collected the item. So I'm going to click on idle to create that animation. I'll click on the little waffle, add frames to sprite sheet, and find my sprites and get my Apple reward and click open. Zoom in a little bit. And so the lines aren't quite matching up because we have 3 vertical and 3 horizontal. So now it matches up. And now I want to pick just that top group, just the idle part. So I'm ignoring these frames because they're part of my collected animation. So I'll click add 3 frames. And then we don't see it. So let's click on the animated sprite and make sure that we're on the idle animation. And we'll click playing is on. And so now we can see this collider is actually pretty well matched to the size of the art. I might move the art down just a little bit. So when I'm trying to move it, notice that I'm probably going to move the collision shape when I'm trying to move it. So let's lock up the collision shape. And now I should be able to move the apple. Oh, and I can't move it because I have snap on. That's why I'm just dragging away from it. So I'm going to turn snap on so I can just move it very precisely. Or snap off rather. And this is pretty good. Sometimes you might want to make your collision shape actually a little bit smaller so that the player actually is like inside of the item when they collect it. Because as soon as we hit this circle, we're going to collect the item. So if it's out here, it's going to look weird because your player is going to collect the item before they get to it. But if we put it down in here, then we'll be overlapping nicely with the item by the time we get there. So I'm actually going to make the collision shape just a little bit smaller. And you can always change this and tweak this if you want to. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And now let's set up our collected animation. So I clicked on the animated sprite and animation frames, sprite frames. Now I'm going to select collected and click the waffle button and then open my sprite. And this time I'm just going to select these last 4 frames. And we can preview this. So I'm going to click on animated sprite and change it to collected. And that looks pretty good, but we don't want it to loop. So I'm going to turn loop off. And so that's what the last frame will look like. And then it'll disappear. So we don't need another frame there. So that looks pretty good. And so I'll turn the default animation back to idle. So that's what it'll appear when we add it into the scene. And then we're going to trigger the collected animation once we achieve it. Okay, so that's our whole object. And if you want to, so that's how you create it from scratch. If you want to, you can always use some of the defaults. So there's an example of this scene under 270 assets. If you go in here and go to scenes and components, the item scene is pretty much the same thing. It's an old version that I did, in a previous semester, and it has a sound in here. We haven't gone over sound yet, so we haven't added that quite yet. But you can see it's pretty much the same exact thing. There's an animated sprite with the collected and the idle. There's a collision shape, and our item is in area 2D. And then this one actually has a couple things attached to it, which we're going to go over now. And then there's a script, which is the default script for an item, which we're going to code from scratch today to go over a few basics. But yeah, if you ever want to just grab that script, you can just get it from here. Okay, so let's add this into the scene, and then we will add some stuff to it. So let's open one of our scenes, and you can add this to any type of scene. It doesn't have to be either a platformer or an RPG. So I'm going to go to scenes, and I'll open up I think my background scene is better to work with for now. So I'll open up my background scene, and then I'll open up my RPG scene, which now doesn't have the blue background. Wonder if I can just add in I should just add in a blue background here, but I'm going to ignore it for now. Anyway, so let's start with the platformer scene. So if I want to add in an item here, let's collapse this background. So I want to make sure everything is nice and organized. So before I just add items in, I'm going to make a node for them to go into, like a folder. So I'm going to click on the main background scene node and click plus and just get a node 2D. And I'll put apples, or you can put items or rewards, whatever you want in there so that we know what these are. So then with my apples, I'm going to click the link button this time. So when I'm adding a component like a scene instance, I want to click the link button rather than the plus button. The plus button is for generic Godot stuff that is built for us. The link button is for stuff that we've created ourselves. So I'm going to click on the link button to instance a child scene. And then I'm just going to type in the name of the scene that I created, which is Apple. And so we can see here scene / component / Apple. I don't know why these ones are coming up, but this is the one that we want. So I'm going to click open. And there we see our apple right here. And so that's pretty good. If I want to move this, I can move it around. And if I want it to move with the grid, I can turn snapping on. Although the grid I have is very wide. So let's update the snap settings to like 16 by 16. Okay, so now I can add an apple over here. And so it's very easy to create more items. Once I have the apple selected, if I hit Control D, that'll duplicate it. And I have another item over here. And so now I have like the very beginning of a little scene. So I have this platformer, and so my player enters this world. They can see there's these apples over here. So they might think like, oh, I want to collect those apples. So I should go over there. But right now we can't collect them, so that's what we need to add. So we need to add a little script in here that will get triggered when the player overlaps with the apple. So we're going to write our first script, and there's a few components in here. Some of it is going to be a little bit confusing to get started, but with programming, it's kind of hard to write scripts that don't kind of do a few different things. So I'll try to explain the basic components, but we will talk more specifically about them in future lessons. But yeah, if you have any questions while we're writing the script, feel free to interrupt me. Let me see if there's any questions. No, okay. So to add a script here, I'm going to click on the scene button, this little scene icon next to one of my apples. That'll take me back to the apple scene. And what I'm going to do here is add a script, and it's going to get applied to all of the instances of the apples in the scene. So I won't have to like change each one. So to add a script, I'm just going to go down here to the scripts field in the inspector all the way at the bottom and click on empty. And again, I could just load the script from assets, but we're going to learn how to write a script. So I'm going to click on new script here. And so I want to make sure this goes in the script folder. So I'm going to click on the folder and go back and make sure to go into the scripts folder. And then here, when we name the script, this is a part that may be a little confusing. So even though this item is an apple, I may have multiple different kinds of items. And so I want a script that will work regardless of what type of item I'm using. So instead of just calling this apple, what I'm going to do is call this an item. And I'm going to give it a more specific name. I'm going to call it an item manager. So it's kind of like saying player controller. We're telling the other developers or other people who might work on this what this script actually does. So it's used to manage the item. So if we interact with the item, it's going to do whatever we need to do to show that interaction. So I'm going to call it item manager.gd for the script, and then click open. And we can see it knows that it's going to be in area 2D. We don't need a template, although let's take a look at the default template, because I'm not sure if we've done that before this semester. So I'm going to turn the template to default, even though I usually do empty. And yeah, that looks good. So now I'm going to click create. So here's what a sort of template script looks like. It kind of gives us some information about how to write a script. And it also has this ready function here, which is going to get called when our scene starts. I actually don't really think we need that. And then it also has a process function, which is called as the scene is running. So we don't really need this stuff, so I'm going to get rid of it, but I'm going to go over what we're going to add in here. And we also have, let's see, the item manager from assets here. So if we get lost at any point, we can just go take a look at this. But a lot of this code is stuff that's actually generated by Godot. So we'll see how that works in a second. So let's go back to our item manager. And the first thing we're going to do is create a variable. And we're going to make this an export variable so we can set it in the editor. And we can set it for different items. So we're going to start with the keyword export. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us access to this value in the inspector over here once we finish the script. So we're going to start with the keyword export, and then we're making a variable, so we say var, which is shorthand for variable. And variable is just a piece of information that we want our program to remember. So right now, the thing that we want our program to remember is what type of item this is. So we're going to create a name for this variable called item_type. And so that name is just the type of item that this is, which is an apple. And so we can set different types for different items, which will change the way that we interact with those items. And so now I have the name for the variable, which you could really write whatever you want here. I could write apple or just item, but we want to be specific. So I'm going to say item_type. And in Godot script, an underscore just goes between two different words in the variable name because we can't put a space like that. So then we're going to assign this variable using the equal sign. And now we're going to give it a value. So for the type, I want to use quotation marks because it's a string. It's a string of characters that I'm going to put in here. And I'm just going to call it apples. That's going to be the default item type. So I'm going to save that. And then when I click on the apple again, and I scroll back up to the top, notice that there's a new field up here called script variables. We see item type here, and then we see apple right there. So if we have a different type of item, like later on, we might add like a life. If you lose a life and then you grab a life to gain a new life, you might have like a life item. You might have like a key, or you might have a specific key like the dungeon key or something like that. So this just gives us a place to kind of say what type of item this is. So I'm going to hit refresh and it'll go back to apple. Okay, so we've got our item type. Now we need something to basically tell the rest of our program that we've collected this item. And so what we're going to use for that is called a signal. A signal is a thing in Godot which we can basically attach parts of our items to other parts of our scene. So when something happens, then we can send a signal to another part of our scene. Actually, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. First, what we want to do, we want to add a signal through the node editor actually first. Okay, so let's click on the apple. So there's this other tab that we haven't looked at before called node over here. And this has all of our built-in signals. So that's actually what we're going to use first. We're not going to create our own signal quite yet. So we have these built-in signals. And you can notice there's a lot of different type of signals here. There's stuff for a basic object, for a basic node, for a canvas item, for a collision object. But here's our area 2D. These are specific events that only an area has. And one of those events that we're going to use is this area entered signal. And that's basically going to tell us if anything else in the scene that's a physics body, like our player, has entered into this area. So if I want to connect this to my script, it's really easy. I just double click on the event that I want, or signal, and then I connect it to the item that has the script that I want on it. So I've connected to the main script here. So then one thing I might want to change is this thing. It generates a receiver method. A receiver method is basically just the script that it creates inside of our item manager. I don't really want this to be called Apple because that's a specific item, but I'm going to have other types of items. So I'm going to change this method to onBodyEntered. If you miss this part, it's not going to break your code. It's not the end of the world, but I just like to have this be a little bit more generic. So I'm going to change that to onBodyEntered and then click connect. And so notice that Godot generated this function for us. Okay, so now we can decide what happens if a body enters into this object. Oh, and I forgot there's another thing that I have to go over in a second, but I think we're doing okay on time. Hopefully it won't take too much longer. Anyway, so one thing that we can do to see if this works, let's just test this first. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to print out the body. So print is a function that will print something from our code to our console. So we'll see what this body is if this event occurs. I'm going to move this up a little bit. I don't like to have a lot of random lines in my code, although it doesn't change anything. And then also just real quick, this func keyword, this means this is a function. It's just a block of code that's separate from the rest of our code that can react to an event or some other thing happening in the game. So let's see if this works. I'm going to go to my background scene and hit play. And now what we have to do is look down a little bit to this output area. So that's where we get messages from our program. And so notice when I go over the apple, the player is what's output. So it knows that this body is the player. So that's pretty cool. We can interact with something that's in our scene. Okay, so one problem that you might run into, and hopefully I can demonstrate this quickly. Oh no, this is an area. So I'm gonna just add in a random body here. So let's add in a static body and just quickly give it a collider and give that a circle. And so I'm just going to put this static body right here. Okay, and I'm going to run my code again. Okay, so notice what gets output right here, static body 2D. So because these two bodies are overlapping, it's triggering that signal even though it's not the player. So one thing we could do in our code is ask, is this the player? But a more efficient thing that we can do, which we're going to use a lot to make our game run well, is use different what's called physics layers. So what we can do is basically assign each one of our bodies a different layer. And so we'll only check if those layers are interacting with each other. So for example, we're obviously going to remove the static body eventually, but let's say this was like an enemy. So this would be an enemy. This is the player, and this is our item. So we can make different layers and say the player needs to check if it's interacting with the enemy and check if it's interacting with the item, and vice versa. The enemy wants to check if it's interacting with the player, the item wants to interact with the player. But we don't want these guys to interact with each other unless the enemy can collect that specific item. And so we can save a lot of time for the computer because actually checking if these things are interacting takes a lot of work for the computer. It has to like check the position and the size and see if it's overlapping with this thing. It's a lot of math. And the less the computer is doing that while we're running the game, the better the game is going to run. So instead of doing this in code, we're just going to use layers to do this. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to the player and open up the player scene. And all of my various colliders have this layer section under the collision, and then they also have this mask section. And so this is a little confusing, but we can assign an item to a layer, and then we can use a mask to check if it's on that layer. Yeah. I think, looks like it goes to 32. I don't know. That's a good question. I've never gone past 32. I think we'll be okay, but if we get there, we can Google it and figure it out. Right. Yeah, I think we'll probably get to like 10. I think we'll be okay. So then if we click on this little drop down here, we can see it just has layers, but we can actually give these layers names to make it easier to select the right layer. So let's make a couple of those right now. So I'm going to go to project settings, and let's see. This is under layer names. And so we're going to go to the 2D physics layers and just give them some names. So we'll start with our player, and then for layer 2, I'll do, we should really do like tile sets here, or let's call this platforms, because we don't actually need everything to interact with our platforms either. And then for layer 3, we'll do item. So these labels don't really change the functionality, they just make it easier for us to assign these things. So now if I refresh this, now we can see the player is selected here. And then the player actually doesn't need a mask because we'll make other things look for the player. So I'm going to turn that off for now. Then I'll go to my Apple scene. So here's my Apple scene. I'll do the same thing, go to collision. And I can click on these boxes, or I can open this up. So I can go up here and say this is a platform. It's not a player. So for the layers, usually it should just be one thing. Oh, it's not a platform. Sorry, it's an item. So for our layers, they usually are just one thing, unless you have some more complicated system going on. But then the mask, it might be looking for multiple things. So our items can interact with the player, but they shouldn't interact with anything else. So player's already selected there, so we're just going to leave that as is. So now if we run our code, we'll see there's a difference. Whoops. I'm going to go back to the background scene and hit play. Uh-oh, there isn't a difference because I forgot to turn off the static body layer. Okay, for this static body, let's just turn off the layer and the mask. So it'll just ignore that. Okay, now I'm going to run the scene again. So now our static body and our apple are still overlapping, but nothing happened in the output. So now we're not looking for those collisions anymore. But if my player runs across, then we do get that collision. Okay, so we're not going to get to everything that I wanted to do, but let's just try to wrap this up so you guys have some time to do some work today. I'm going to get rid of this static body. So now we just want to actually, make the player collect the item. So let's go back to our apple. So in our script, once we know that the player has collected the item, we could just make the item disappear, right? But that would look kind of abrupt. And so we're going to do something that we'll see a lot, this pattern, where instead what we're going to do is we're going to trigger an animation, and then we're going to add a new signal so that when the animation is done, that's when we'll remove the item from the scene. So for this part of the script, once we've gotten the item, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a reference to the animated sprite. So I can reference any node inside of the Apple node by using a $sign. And so when I hit the $sign, notice that Godot actually shows me the nodes that are in there. So I'm just going to choose the animated sprite and hit enter. So now I want to play an animation. So if I want to do something with that node, if I hit the dot here, it'll show me all the different things I can do with that node. And what I want to do is play an animation. So I'm going to use play here. And then I have to tell it what animation I want to play. But notice the code is helping me again here. So once I hit the parentheses to put the name of the animation, it shows me the two animations that are here. So I'm going to choose the collected animation. I'm going to save this. So now that animation is going to play. And we're going to add another signal that will look for when that animation is done. And when it's done, it's going to remove our object from the scene. One little thing that we have to do before we do that I just remembered, is we also have to make sure that we don't trigger the animation multiple times. So this isn't likely to happen in this instance, but notice when I'm running back and forth on the apple. Oh, it actually triggered the thing. Oh, and I took the print statement out, so now we don't see that. But anyway, as long as the apple's still there, I could trigger this signal a bunch of times, and I don't want that to happen. There's an easy way to prevent that from happening. I've just used another variable to track the state of the item, and I just flip it. So I'm going to make a different variable. This is not an export variable because this doesn't need to be exposed to the editor. So I'm going to make a variable called isCollected. And this variable is what's called a Boolean. It can only be true or false. So we're going to use this to track whether or not we've collected this particular item. And this will be different for each item. So we're going to say isCollected is false. And so as long as the item is not collected, we can collect the item. So we have to add a second line in here before we play the animated sprite. We're going to check to see if the thing is collected first. So the way that we do that is we say if is collected. And if it is collected, or actually we want to know the opposite, right? We want to know if it's not collected. So we're going to say if not is collected. So as long as this is false, then we will run the rest of this code. So this is a little if statement. This is called the conditional statement in programming. And so it lets us ask questions about the state of our item. So if this is not collected, then we're going to play our animation. And then we're also going to say is collected equals true. So this is a really common pattern in programming where we're tracking the state of this thing. So when the thing first enters the scene, it's not collected. But once it gets collected, we set it to true. So that way we can't collect it more than once. But this is going to be, since the script is attached to each instance of the item, each version of the item will have its own script like this. I'm going to click save here, and we're just about done with this part. I'm going to go down here. Another thing that you are probably noticing is that I'm indenting every time I use a colon here. So this is a Godot script convention that is borrowed from Python and some other languages, where once I start a new block of code, like inside this function, everything inside the block of the code is indented over, which makes it easier to read. And I can also collapse this function like this to make it easier to read. So then this new block of code under this if statement gets indented again. So I can also collapse this block. And then when I want to create a new function, I just go back to the original main indentation. Okay, so we're almost done. So we're triggering these animations. And now once the animation is finished, we just have to remove the item. I'm going to go back to the apple. On my animated sprite, it has its own specific nodes. So one of those nodes is animation finished. So when that animation finishes, that collected animation is done, then we can remove the item from the scene. So again, all I have to do for this one is double click here. And I'm going to connect it to the apple. So I'm connecting the signal to the item. And I want to make this just on animated finish, although on animated sprite, animation finish would probably be fine. Actually, it's probably fine. I'm just going to leave this. I'm going to hit cancel. I'll just leave it as is because all of our items will have animated sprites regardless of what type of item they are. Although I guess they might just have one sprite. So yeah, let's just change this to on animation finish. That'll be more generic. And I'll click connect. So this is going to create this function for me. And I'm just going to ask if this item has been collected. I'm going to say if is collected. So that makes sure that I don't get rid of the item before the animation is finished and before it's been collected. Now I'm going to use a special function in Godot that just removes this particular item from the scene, which is queue free. So you can see when I type in QU, it comes up. It's just QUE free. And so I just put that into the code. And this should remove my apples. So let's give that a try. I'm going to go back to the background scene. Okay, so I'm going to go over here. So I can eat the apple, and then it disappears. So that's pretty cool. So now I can start to collect items. I don't know how many items I have yet, so I wanted to do that as well, but I think we'll leave that for another time for now, because we've already covered a lot of concepts. I kind of forgot how much stuff you have to be able to do just to collect an item. But anyway, that is how you collect an item. When we continue on Thursday with an obstacle, we'll go over sort of similar code, but we'll add some other components to it. So it'll do different things like an obstacle rather than an item, but there's a lot of similarities in what we'll be doing on Thursday. Mallory says, I'm thinking about the game Baba Is You a lot during this lesson. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Baba Is You is a really cool game. Have you guys ever played that game? Baba Is You? It's cool. It's sort of like a meta game. It's kind of like a game about making a game in a way. See if we can. You can like move around these different blocks and they connect together, and they're kind of like little mini scripts essentially, like you're kind of like programming with the game. It's pretty cool. I would check it out. I played it a long time ago. I don't really remember it that well, but it's also just like a fun puzzle game. It does have a similar aesthetic to what we're doing too, because it's the pixel design. Anyway, let me stop recording and see if there are